Hello and welcome to the Contingent Agencies Cross-Disciplinary Symposium here in Zentrum Fokus Forschung, a unit of the Universities of Applied Arts, Vienna. My name is Alexander Damjanic. I'm the head of this institute. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you here in the space and time and also online. So let's get it started. I will briefly introduce you or briefly give you the names of the participants of this closing panel, which will be then further explained by our dear colleagues about the context of the two key figures of that artistic research project. So this closing panel will consist of Arno Böhler, Emma Cocker, Gerd Diermoser, Michaelo, Sabine Holzer, Paula Kramer, Dieter Mersch, Hans-Jörg Reinberger, Andreas Spiegel, Nikolaus Gansterer, and Alexa Tiaga. Let's hope for colleagues that haven't attended yet that they join in later. If not so, nevertheless, let's give it a go. Nikolaus and Alex, please.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Thank you all for being here, and very especially thank you all for those who have been here the whole week, working intensively with us. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to join this we could say, working conference, and thank you for being still there in the last day. I would like just to briefly give some ideas about, key ideas about the research project Contingent Agencies. Contingent Agencies is a project that we both, Nikolaus and I, conceived in order to inquire into the relationship between atmospheres and agencies. There were some very general departing points, and actually probably the most basic departing points is that the atmospheres we all inhabit, the way a situation is present for us, might depend, might be conditioned, might be constrained by different agencies in touch. That's why contingent agencies, and this can be agencies from all kind of elements participating in this situation: human, non-human, living, non-living, from light to sound, from color to material, from artifacts to people, and so on. So we span this research framework in order to investigate how this happened, even if this departing point is the right one. Furthermore, we thought that in order to realize this inquiry was necessary to develop an own methodic, or at least to describe certain practices that would be able to address these questions possibly in a non-reductive way. And we conceived two spheres of practices that we name in a problematic way: notations and reflections. Somehow this is the field, the framework that we offer for other researchers to join us and to knock on our hypothesis, to knock on our presuppositions, to check if this is the right way to do it, and what can agencies mean, what can atmospheres mean, how can they relate to one another, what can mean to notate the relationship between an agency and atmosphere, what can mean to then reflect on it or reflect it, mobilizing again the agency of notations. So this symposium that we are closing today was a framework exactly to do so. and I have to say, and it's part of the gratitude I tried to show at the beginning, that it has been extremely enriching. So we have really done this. We have really set everything in question, and we have explored, hands-on explored practice, not only practice-based, but through practices, all these presuppositions, hypotheses, and working methods. I said the symposium comes today to an end, and this is true. Well, tomorrow we have a kind of an open house situation, and you are all very welcome to join us. But the project does not finish here. The project go in the next phase. In this phase, will be focused on a publication, or better say, on two parallel publications. One is the website of the project, which is already online, and you can visit. You can find a lot of our work, also already work we have been doing this week on this web page, and this web page will be there in order to continue this inquiry. We are facing also the new project based also on this work done in the last years and in the last days to try to make a book kind of presenting, collecting all these ideas and practices. In this sense, this is not the end. This is a turning point from this phase of work into the next. I hope you all here and also you all online continue being with us for the, let's say, until the end of the project and beyond, because the website will be there, and that this is the beginning of a research project that does not end when officially our project ends. Nikolaus.
Yes, from my side, I also want to say thank you to all the co-researchers on human level first, but also on non-human level. Also, fantastic place here at the Zentrum Fokusforschung to get invested in these questions. When we were thinking in the group, in the collective, how we want to structure this closing panel, we realized that there maybe are some doubts how that should happen. And we found that we would like to combine two modes of getting invested also in that kind of sharing and thinking about what has happened in that week through two sets of questions or two sets of practices. One maybe more conceptual and language-based approach or set of practices, and one which is really working aesthetically with the material, so about and through. And that will structure the first 60 minutes of tonight. There will be like these different practices interwoven, following each other, interrogating each other. And afterwards, we really look forward to get in a discussion also with the audience, for those who came, to raise questions. You can also see the space is filled with notations, reflections, artifacts. We regard them also as co-researchers in the research project. So there will be different modes of getting in touch with them, and that is really crucial, I think, for the project. Yeah, maybe there are pens and paper at that little table. So if you come up with a question, please feel free to take one of these ancient notation tools, or to draw, or yeah, to get in a responsive state of mind. And as a very last thing, please switch your phones in flight mode. Thank you so much.
in the multiplicity of it all, I note this space is not neutral. Privileges are visible. This space is very white. This space has been very white. Throughout the week, I'm moving with an attention to temperature, to light, and to the wind. Inextricably linked, yet standing on their own, speaking on their own, marking my movements differently. Temperature brings lines, brings surface, brings expansion, contraction, and the moon. It's the cold that accentuates the linear in my movement, the warmth bringing surface and depth and expansion, contraction when it's cold. With light, I study differentiation. And again, depth, but a different kind of depth. It's the depth between two leaves of dandelion, deep down. Light builds channels and volumes. It highlights and accentuates three-dimensionality. Licht hat keine Eile. Die Eile hab ich. With wind came playfulness and surprise. Locally, here, and beyond. I am hit by the wind just like the tree, just like you as a whole and in parts. I'm hit by the wind just like the tree. just like you as a whole and in my parts. Thank you.
So during this last week, I have been working with a network of interlocking, perhaps even interdependent language and lens-based practices, only using my laptop as a recording device. 1, marking a video, recording and covering the laptop camera with paper when the conditioning influence of a given agency on the atmosphere is registered. 2, live writing, recording of writing as a live event. And 3, voicing observation, recording of spoken word, both for attending to how the conditioning influence of a given agency on the atmosphere is registered. I've often been unable to separate notation from reflection practices, preferring to consider them as hyphenated practices, contiguous practices, mutually interdependent. Over the week, what has emerged in response to the framework has been an immediate modality of notation hyphen reflection that attempts to be in touch directly, immediately with the atmosphere-agency relation taken as the focus, and a mediated modality of notation hyphen reflection practiced in touch with the artifacts of the immediate mode. Thirdly, a form of kairotic or even contingent notation has also emerged, forms of notation that reveal themselves by chance as moments of timely opportunity, the flutter of paper for marking the agency of wind, the same paper over the lens for registering the changes in light. My interest has been in how to bring the artifacts from these immediate and mediated encounters into relation, sometimes folding the one into the other as a second layer, an annotation within the same frame, or through adjacency, the placing side by side. Contiguous artifacts, contingent artifacts, combination, overlapping, interrelation, interweaving. I'm interested in the contingency of these artifacts, how they might even have a liveness of their own. Specifically, how might new combinations and conjunctions arise in the looping and repetition as the relation of more than one part falls out of sync, proposing infinitely unfolding permutations? During this event, I am practicing a mediated reflection in relation to the artifacts that you can see presented on the monitor through a live writing practice, playing with the line between transcribing a previous voice notation that I'm listening to and intervening in that with further reflection. I notice, however, that it is hard to attend to the original atmosphere as it bleeds into the one unfolding now. This project has raised many questions and issues. Here are just 3 that I am wrestling with. 1, the impossibility of separation and differentiation, part 1. The Buddhist principle or even teaching of conditionality or of dependent co-arising has been in my thoughts a lot this week, that all phenomena arise in dependence on other phenomena. How then to focus on the relation of one agency? For focusing on one has revealed only further the sense of interdependency. 2, the impossibility of separation, differentiation, part 2. The relation of different practices of noticing, of notating, of reflection have felt increasingly interdependent, impossible for me to conceive as separate and distinct. What then is at stake in the attempt to delineate one practice from another, or what is enabled through their interwovenness, their hyphenation? 3, how to be as precise as possible. From last night's talk by Karen Barrard, poetics is the best attempt to be as rigorous as possible. Precise vagueness, circling, obliqueness, confusion, meaning the state of being mixed together, opacity, illegibility. My own inquiry has tended towards a tentative poetics through the combination, conjunction, contiguity of artifacts. So how does the indeterminacy of atmosphere call for other ways of being precise? What practices and approaches might be required?
So, hello everybody. So Emma addressed this question of interdependency of different agencies, and I would like to shift the focus on the relation between notational practices and reflection. And I use my own experience as the starting point. So I started the week with a strong feeling of that we are invited to, in the conceptual frame that Alex and Nikolaus have prepared for us, we were invited to study specific atmospheres with focus of a chosen agency through notational practices. And then we had moments of reflection, and then we thought about tactics of sharing. And when I started to think about how to study the atmosphere here in this building, I had the strong feeling that whatever I do, that will influence the atmosphere. So instead of avoiding that or seeing that as a problem, I wanted to deal with this in practice. And that led me to do something I call on-site notations, and one of them is here in the doorway. So these are notations I did directly in the space, in these rooms, in relation to the objects and elements and everything that is here. And then in this process of notating, I had a strong feeling that if it in any sense is in relation to the atmosphere, it needs to be sensitive. I have to proceed in a medium sensitive way. And then in that process, some form of reflective moment is necessarily incorporated in the way I do the notations. So for me, it became in a way study about the relation between the notational practices and reflection on the level of things, I would say. And now I would like to invite Hans-Jörg Reinberger to bring in his voice and point of view, maybe starting with this question of notation or notational practices. And I hand over the microphone to Hans-Jörg Reinberger.
Yeah, what should I say to notation? Yeah, I think I follow your path, and and talk about my own experience regarding notation that is or has been taking place in a different environment and in a different atmosphere, if you like, namely the atmosphere of the laboratory, where a lot of notational activity is going on, and an activity that is also differently located with respect to the central point that the laboratory turns around, namely the process of experimentation. And we could kind of make a crude division of the notating processes as being related to the experiment, either in the phase where an experiment is being set up, or in the phase where the outcome of an experiment is being reflected. And in both of these cases you encounter, and I think it is almost inevitable, notational practices, usually in the traditional form with a sheet of paper and a pencil. And if I kind of should try to give not a definition but a characterization what these two different ways of taking notes or doing notes are about, then we possibly could say that notation is a material form of preliminary reflection. So that's how I would put it: a material form of preliminary reflection. Yeah. And I think this is very important, because reflection without materiality, in my opinion, leads nowhere. You need it in order to, in this area, in order to be able to enter into an iterative process. And to enter into an iterative process presupposes that you fix preliminarily something which you can use as a stepping point for doing the next step. And I think this iterativity that with respect to the experiment, on the one hand, can lead to the experiment in all its preliminarity, and on the other hand, it can lead away from the experiment into a more general realm of drawing things together, as my colleague Bruno Latour would possibly say. So maybe that much to notation, the practice of notation in this particular context.
Thanks. We will proceed probably here, but I would like to highlight one thing that you said, that reflection without materiality leads nowhere. I think it was, at least for me, a poignant observation. Thank you. who is next?
Notification, reflection, agency. So I was very happy to be able to share this atmosphere here for 1 week with all these artists, with this incredible space which we had here. And I think it was a very interesting atmosphere for me as a philosopher, because it was an inspiring atmosphere. And when I take this concept of inspiration seriously for one moment, it means that what I am saying right now would not be possible without being in touch with this whole week of people and working and objects which we produced. So inspiration was exactly the idea that the thought is not coming like in Descartes from the cogito itself, not I am thinking, I was thinking what I'm saying right now, but a lot of what I am saying right now is already a receptive way of responding to the atmosphere, to the thoughts, to the sharing of the objects which are here. That is exactly what Spinoza thought. It's an external cause that makes me think in this way as I'm reflecting right now on atmosphere. And therefore, when Heidegger says thinking is close to thanking, I want to thank to this space and this environment and this 1 week, which made me think what I'm now able to think. Now, we said, I want to make now for some minutes atmosphere the agency. This is a terminology which we had here, and it just means that I make it the subject, but not the subject just that it is now the subject of what I want to speak about, but also in the second sense that I am subjecting myself under this topic. So it's not only that I as a subject speak about the atmosphere, but I try also to make me a subjectum, somebody who is receiving and responding to the atmosphere, so that the atmosphere in a certain way becomes the agency of what I say. And there were several moments which were very interesting or inspiring for me as a philosopher. One was that I was drawn back through this atmosphere, which we shared here, to the old theory in philosophy of the elements. Yeah? And usually, especially in Indian philosophy, we have 5 elements, and therefore I made a notation for this reflection on the agency of atmosphere. Yeah? So this is a notation I made for this short minutes which I'm able to speak, and usually there is an elemental. If we speak about atmosphere, I think we speak about elemental bodies, and I want to take this literally. So that means that I speak what the old cultures called, I speak about wind, we had this already. I speak about fire, sun. I speak about water. I have drawn it here because in ancient culture it was the solar ocean that was the upsphere. So the heaven was an ocean in a certain way, a solar ocean. So I have this one sphere here, which is water. I have here the fire, the wind coming in, the fire that goes between heaven and earth, and I have here the earth. But why 5 elements? Because there is one more element which is drawn here as a sign, which means ether or space. So there are 5 elements, and this 5th aspect that interests me most in this week, because I tried to ask now, can I situate this atmosphere here in this space where we are right now? So I indicated here the location in which we are, because that's a cosmic atmosphere. But it's an atmosphere, a situated atmosphere only if I now bring myself in a relation to these 5 elements in a situated place. And then suddenly it's the atmosphere like we saw in Paula. Yeah? It's not just the cosmic atmosphere, but it's a way how these 5 elements of an elemental body mix in this special place like a soup, like a mix of these 5 elements. And that is an elemental body. And what is really also another moment which was very interesting for me, not to bring this atmosphere me back to these thoughts of the old elements, which by the way, Merleau-Ponty says the flesh works like an element. Yeah? So I was drawn back to these old concepts, yeah? And in a certain way now, to bring this atmosphere in this situated context here, I was asking myself, how can I relate to these 5 aspects of the elemental bodies at this place or not at any other place? Yeah? How do they mix here, and how can I in a certain way start to get in an entanglement of these 5 elements in an awareness in a certain way? And therefore, you see here this window where I bring this place here into a marker. This is now happening here, and her performance in certain way here starts to shape this local atmosphere. And this was a struggle which I always had, because my reflection also is a notation here, because it obviously changes also the atmosphere of this situated space. So I always had the problem to distinguish between reflection and notation, because now my reflection is a notation that shapes this way of atmosphere. So this was what was happening here. Now, if I want to connect myself in this space, I was trying out practices, how can I connect myself in this space with this fifth element of space itself? And this was very inspiring yesterday, which I had with the lecture with Karen Barat, because she in a certain way says when we as existing bodies, and my organism is also an existing body, have a certain kind of capacity to entangle with these infinite potentials, which she said. So how can I make this entanglement something which happens now in this very moment of the atmosphere? That was really, that was my
Thank you, Arno. So this was a reflection on the one notation of Mika with this intervention of space, and I collected 7 gestures. And with these 7 gestures, I traced the atmospheres in different spaces in a physical matter. So I always think the bodies are writing space, human and non-human bodies, and I try to put these gestures in relation to the given atmosphere. Thank you. And in relation to Arno and his text also, of course. Thank you.
Which might bring us to the question of reflection. And this brings us to the question which we would like to bring forward to Dieter Mersch in this situation, responding potentially to the performance and the performance lecture we have just seen, regarding the notation, the space, and the reflection, the tension between notation and reflection in this regard. Could you kind of like briefly give your take on what you've just experienced here, and also maybe in the moments you interacted with that space and event?
Maybe it's difficult to make this briefly. I would like to start with a short narrative. When I was a young mathematician, I also was very much involved in the art world in Cologne. And I always went to the galleries of the new art exhibitions, and I understood nothing. And because of this non-understanding, I repeatedly went to the gallery again in order to capture it better. That's what I didn't understand, but it was impossible, so I only could I only could affirm that there's a certain insufficiency in trying to name or to signify or to notate in a way that what we experience. So there is a deep gap between that what we feel if we perceive something, or what captures us if we perceive something, and that what is notatable, if that is an English word, I don't know, and that what we can express in language. So from the beginning on, my problem, and therefore I'm deeply skeptical about everything. My ongoing experience through my whole lifetime was that we can only offer different languages in that way that we try to respond in a way to the reality we perceive or we experience. And this constant responding also means that there is an indeterminacy principle in it, because we are already involved in that situation that we experience, and responds at the same time, and through responding we receive in a certain way this situation. Therefore, when it comes to atmosphere and the notion of atmosphere as a notion, I'm also skeptical about this notion, because it depends on how we describe it, what kind of concepts, notion, or words we find to relate to that what atmosphere might be. We have to admit already that we are part of an atmosphere that we cannot describe properly. So there's also this insufficiency in it. But the best we can do, and therefore I liked very much your gestures, the best we can do is we can answer to it in a way. We are constantly answering. We are constantly, as being in the world, we are constantly answering beings, so to speak, responding beings, responding, reacting in that way that we repeatedly try to make a stance, put us into a position, or relate to something. But these relations are not relations in that way that we already have an idea about it, but it is a constant practice of responding that immediately transform the situation. And we are in this ongoing transformational process, and therefore the atmosphere, or that what we might feel at an atmosphere in order to try to understand what it is, or to notate what it is. In doing so, the atmosphere is already gone in a way. It has already transformed into something different, and so we are in the middle of this permanently differential process of transformation.
Thank you, Dita. And maybe this is a very good starting point for what I want to share with you. Probably it's better if you feel free to move in this direction, because what I want to share with you is basically on this surface. So it would be good if you maybe displace yourself in this direction to be able to see the screen. Thank you. So what I would like to share with you very briefly are some ideas and some practices I am developing in this framework. And what I want to share with you is actually, or I want to share these ideas and these practices taking as reference what I call a dispositive for reflecting, in brackets, on, meaning reflecting on or reflecting, the relationship between the agency of, in this case, the threshold or a threshold between inside and outside and a specific atmosphere. This is a case study. This is a case study for me. I did these days. Referring to these case studies, I would like to share with you, as I said, some of the approaches actually, and the way I realize them. I will do this in 3 steps, and the first steps begin, let's say, try to begin from the beginning. So, and this beginning refers to 3 varieties of awareness that are my starting point to do this work. An awareness on atmospheres, or better say, an awareness on a atmosphere, the atmosphere that is present for me in a given moment, the moment I begin to notate. The presence of a specific agency, or better said, the agency of one element of the situation in which I am when I begin to notate. And a third form of awareness, which is the awareness on the presence of one presence in the other presence, so the presence of the actualization of one of the agency of this element into this atmosphere which is already present for me. So already the starting point is quite complex, because it's about 3 different presences, one, let's say, basic presences, and a third one which is a relationship between these both. And the point for me, also the very striking point at the very beginning of this process, and which is I'm trying actually to deal with, is that these presences are not presences through a process of perception. So there is my first idea that I would like to share with you, the point that that atmospheres and agencies are present, but not through processes of perception, that is, not as perceptions. How then can be present if not through perception, and how then can be present if not through perception, if I defend the idea that this presence is an immediate presence. Tentatively, I use the word sensing, so we don't perceive atmospheres, we don't perceive agencies, and we don't perceive the relationship between both, but we sense them. Taking this as the departing point, and I'm going to now to go to my second part. I mobilize different practices in one session of notation. In this case was photography, so from photographic recording, sound recording, and writing. I practiced these three practices, let's say, in the framework of a notation simultaneously, so iterating from one practice to the other. But what is for me interesting to share with you, and I'm very curious what you think about it, and then is that is what notation means. So let's say, what is the operation I fulfill when I say I am notating? Yeah? Departing from the basic idea that atmospheres, agencies, and their relationship are not perceivable, which actually is based on the idea that they are not objectual. So any operation that relates to grasping, catching, or representing has to be discarded. Yeah? So if, and this would be my second, let's say, strong proposition, if an atmosphere, if an agency, and if the relationship between both is not perceivable, is not a perception, is not an object, means that an atmosphere, an agency, and their relationships are not possible to be represented. So then what? What can notation be? My way, my approach is to say, well, I conceive these practices of notations as practices that should allow or should enable the resonance of, to keep resonating the resonance of an agency into an atmosphere. So the idea is to reinforce a process which is there. So the big question is, say, how can we notate if we are dealing with processes? Yeah? And there is the idea of resonance, which is already present in the idea of an agency resonating in an atmosphere, what I try to realize when I notate. Yeah? And there we are very close to this point, which is exactly the turning point for me between notation and reflection. Yeah? So the third step is the step of constructing what I call a dispositive, in a Gamben sense, a dispositive for reflection, or I would even say for aesthetic reflection on the relationship of an atmosphere in a given agency. So the idea of constructing an apparatus or a dispositive is led by the same attempt to keep resonating the initial resonance in order to bring this resonance in touch with the one who wants to reflect, the one who is wanted to reflect, the ones who wanted to enter in contact with an agency and, of course, an atmosphere in which this reflector can impossibly be in touch directly. Yeah? So the idea is to realize certain dispositions of the artifacts that are produced by the practices of notation in order to induce a reflective disposition in the practitioner that wants to go the next step of reflection. I think I would stop there, and I hand over to Alexander, who is there, for him to open up the space for our dialogue. Thank you.
So, as Alex already did, telling me to open up that space, he opened up the space. Who is there to join into this reflection, presentation, experience of the last couple of days? If not so, I would like to bring a brief question forward, maybe to Alex and maybe also to the others in the room. There is a quote, I think it's from Rilke. He's talking about die Dauer zwischen zwei Weilen. Yeah? So what is it happening in this moment between two whiles? And there is no actually proper translation of while in English, as far as I've just checked it, as far as I could find. But isn't it about actually in the artistic practice very much so to figure out what is between those moments and then find a way actually to capture it with something of a kind of notation that you could bring it that way? Maybe this is also a question to the man behind the machine over there, to Nicholas. Aren't you really doing actually this, capturing these moments between the entities that actually aren't defined and bringing it to a point of materiality we had it before?
Yes, I think also, as you know, my practice for a while, I could very much link to this description of the two whiles. I'm not even sure if it's two. It feels often as there is like more than two, or beyond that it is to be, like counted, yeah. But you said like, isn't artistic practice often about that? And there I somehow often find a discomfort when I look to other artistic practices, because they are concerned with something very else. And we had that also like in the discussion with Andreas Spiegel, who unfortunately cannot join because he got sick. So Andreas, if you see us online, thank you for all your beautiful impulses during the week. But he said like there is often a confusion, no? When you look at an artwork and when you look at notation, and the notation is the invitation somehow to continue with that process, also what you said, like that is as a first touching, yeah.
And the artwork is to stop with the process?
Yeah, often artworks, or at least I find often that they don't lead me so much further in that state of being between the two wilds. But
if I can react very directly, as I said, I think that in relation to these, our object of research, because it is not an object, the operation of capturing, for me, is absolutely excluded. Yeah? Absolutely excluded, impossible. Yeah. So this is, let's say, not the way. Yeah. So what we can do with that, to put it in very simple terms, is not this. Yeah. This does not mean that we cannot do anything. Of course we can. The question is, what are the possible operations with this? Yes, it's a very basic question. I think in any form of research. Yeah, and that's why I think that we have, if this is true, we should go for other possible operations. That's what the way I found what they are saying and the idea of contingency, as Emma said, and she talks about contingent artifacts. Yeah, not only being artifacts. So, in the sense of artifacts being in a meshwork of touches, I would say. Yeah, touch with the reference of notation, which is not what is notated. It cannot be notated in the sense of grasp, but is in touch with it, is in touch with other artifacts, and this is the idea of an apparatus, a dispositive, and allows the touch also with those who wants to follow the process, to continue the process further. So this would be the idea.
I've seen some reaction from Dieter Mersch over there. Do you want to?
Yes, I would like to underline that capturing, the operation of capturing is impossible in a way. It is just a failure. Therefore I emphasized the notion of responding, which is very near to what you mean by resonance in a way. resonating with the we. That means we are doing something different in reacting of it. And strangely, if we try to give them a language or vocabulary, we always have to constantly repeat the we, because we are constantly in that. But if you look at your experience or look at a certain way of objects or materials you're dealing with, in that way, everything becomes a character of a passage, of a transition. We are always already in this transitional process. There is nothing that we can fix in a way. Also, and this is a truism in a way, there is no truth in that way, that there is something substantial and fixable. We are already in this process of indeterminacy in a way, because we are in this transitional state. And so to speak, the source or the origin from where we start fades away, and also that goal where we are seemingly going to fades also away. We are in the middle and in a way seeing nothing.
Yeah, you bring
this
it up.
is my answer, by the way, because you mentioned the fifth element, which is a quintessence, of course, in the Western thinking, and the Western thinking was always in search of the quintessence. But my answer to this quintessence is that this constant transitional state, or this constant passage.
Yeah, two responses. I wanted to respond to you. So the we, that was, I wanted to ask you, and you answered in a certain way already, the we. I think there is a difference. Yeah, with the last thing, I'm very with you. But I would ask, what was interesting for me and what this whole week brought in suddenly, is because I was not working focusing on atmosphere. But what was really interesting for me was what I said, that the five elements came, this old series came back in a certain way. Now, when I ask we, so do we mean a modern subject, or in much in the Deleuzian way, that means really the elements are the first forces which speak in this we. That was triggering my problem, yeah? So when we say we, it's really that, make it very naive, light, wind, these elements, fire, they are the first agencies. And there was one moment which was very interesting for me, that I had a short morning thing where I said Gemütskräfte. So when we speak of temper, of Gemütskräfte, so which forces, what if the forces, the first five forces which we feel, as Alex says, which only can be sensed and felt, are the five elements which are everywhere in the classical, but they locate at a certain plate in a certain manner where they reflect these elements. So they are everywhere, but in this space now, this soup, or rasa, as in Asia they say, this soup is mixing in a concrete, special, situated made. But the soup of the five elements is in a certain way not locable, but these five elements are in a certain way everywhere. So these would be the first feelings which we had. That would be my theory. It is what makes our temper in a certain way. So the we would really be the five elements who in the first place do this. And the second thing is just, that exactly this is why Akasha interested me suddenly, because it is the absence in the presence. Yeah? So light I can localize somewhere, yeah? And the wind, I would say, is somewhere in the air. But space itself, I cannot localize anymore. That, yeah, it is like Plato says, Cora, in the way of granting all these things to happen and to be, but it itself, as Plato already said, and Derrida says, it is not there. And therefore it's a certain way the lack in these 5 elements, which exactly trigger then that we are trying to grasp it, but this 5th element you cannot grasp anymore, because from the other 4 elements it's seen as an absence. And so that was just the we, what I was interested with, which you were using. Sorry.
I didn't talk about we, but R-E, re, the repetition thing. No?
I always heard we. Sorry.
So wonderful misunderstanding, I would say.
Yes, the re in a certain way tries to fill the gap. That I would absolutely agree.
So I will want to shift the topic a bit. Is it? Yeah, so during the week I often propose that we, because like we see also now, that each of us brought with us different vocabularies. And then I proposed that it would be helpful to bring in, if not synonyms, at least related terms, and somehow try to negotiate between different approaches. And then one issue I brought in, the question of how, if we are working with this notion of notation, so what does it serve, and what does it imply in the context of artistic research? And the vocabulary I know better, or with which I work more, is, for example, the notion of exposing practice as research that has been developed by Michael Schwab, for example. So in relation to that vocabulary, the notational practices, there would be the question, does the notation as practice imply that it is somehow the first step towards some kind of discursivization of practice? Or does it imply that the practice itself is in some sense textual? And that would be one issue. And another related term would be what Florian Dombois has introduced, the not yet art. So then the question would be where the notational practices we were doing during the week, something like not yet art. Namely, would the notational practices serve the arts? So this were my proposals, to open up this vocabulary to related terms.
Maybe to get somebody else in the discussion. Is there somebody?
Yeah, maybe that is a kind of follow-up of what you just have been putting before us, but it also tries to bring it a step further, and I would like to formulate it as a question to the organizers, because over the past days we have talked and experienced a lot about atmospheres, and usually the atmosphere comes with a connotation of immersion, but on the other hand and brings with it its own agency. But on the other hand, your project has another epithet coming with it, namely contingency, contingent agency, and not just agency. And if one would try to find a corresponding word for atmosphere, then that would be something for you to think about. What could it mean, contingent atmospheres? So for me, the notion of contingency brings with it a moment of surprise, of distancing, of being thrown out of an atmosphere. And I think this is an absolutely necessary element of reflection, because reflection consists in this kind of contingent reaction. It comes with an element of estrangement, reflection. And I did not see where this element of your project is kind of taking form in all the offers that we were exposed to in this week. So that would be a question to you.
Or shall we collect another statement and then get to it? Yeah. Okay, so then you address directly. Wonderful.
Yeah, this is one of the questions, but I would say thank you for the question, but I don't, I don't know, this is what I feel. No, really thank you for the question. I think the leading element for us to refer to this term of contingency refers directly to its etymology in terms of contingere, as something different than containing. Yeah? So in the containing act, you have the moment of grasping, contenere, in opposition or in difference to this contingere, which relates to touch. No? Tingere, to touch. And I think there is where we began to so this was the first reason to choose this word or this concept of contingency, because our first one of the first hypotheses is that all these agencies that, in my take, phenomenological and activist take, say, are conditions for and of the emergence of an atmosphere. There is this element of touching, of relationship between agencies that allows an atmosphere to emerge in the very specific way it does. Yeah. So there is where I think we found that. I always think that, I mean, that the way we choose, and I'm going to also to criticize somehow our own approach, which has been already also criticized implicitly and explicitly by other practitioners in this week, is the idea of focusing on one agency. Yeah? Emma said this clearly, also said and showed this clearly, Paula too. So how to differentiate between these agencies if they are contingent? Yeah? So if they are inseparably, also with Bharat yesterday, or also with Manning the day before, in touch with one another. Yeah, this is a problem, but there is where I found this element of contingency, and then me personally, I try to disclose this element of contingency by establishing different forms of touch, of contact between the object of research and the artifacts that might emerge, or me first, and the artifacts that might emerge through the practices we call practices of notation. But it's true that you are introducing. So you are introducing elements that is true, that relate to this element of contingency. This moment of surprise, or this moment of let's say, change of direction that you find in the optical definition of reflection. Yeah. So something touches one surface, in the case light, and suffers an alteration, and there will be also in this transitional moment in which a difference is created. Yeah. So I think this is something that in very different ways, and we will need more time to show this, you can find in all different practices that we propose to call practice of notation, but that we have kind of extended in the sense of practice of immediacy, or immediate contact, or immediate touch with the relationship between agencies and atmosphere. This is what I could say about that. But for sure, this is an element that needs, 4 years or 3.5 years of project seems to be long, but it's extremely short. And that's what I like very much to think about projects as beginning. Yeah. So it really, you take something seriously, in 3.5 years, you can set up the basis of a project. And this is, I think, what is happening. So in this sense, this contribution is highly relevant.
There's you, and then Emma.
So I'm really sorry I didn't catch the moment, the kairos, the atmosphere, when I should have taken the microphone then. So now there has been another question, and now we've been following all different directions, and now I will have to have a lot of work, to bring it back. But when you were talking about the moment between the while and the while, I realized that I've always been enamored with Celan's Atemwende, the turn of breath. And then I thought about, my first interest before I became a philosopher, don't ask me why I did that, was metaphor, language, poetry. And I think the reason why I've been coming here all these last days is because you seem to be doing something in a different medium, not in language as poetry does, in different materials that, leads us to grasp better, right? You said sense better. That which we could call atmosphere. I'm not even sure I'm happy with the expression, but if we use that expression, I thought that a Celan poem, it doesn't represent an atmosphere, it doesn't express it, it is it. Now, I'm not trying to be ontological here, I'm trying to put my finger right on this problem of practice. What the words do in Celan's poems is, they're touching themselves in a way so that they can be this atmosphere. They are reflections in the material of the words. And I think what you've been doing is, doing this with other materials, not words. And I thank you for that.
Yeah. Maybe I want to return to the idea of the representational, or the problem of the representational. I think partly because I wonder whether there are also alternatives to the not that. So one possible alternative, I think, is exhaustion. So rather than a not that, to look more towards and to try and exhaust. So I think the challenge of the not that is that it can potentially create an impasse in the sense of how then. And one of the things I have observed in my own approaches at times is that sometimes, even though I know it is not the way, it's sometimes necessary to begin from that futile, failing, inadequate place in order to get to this not yet. So this not yet that you were speaking of, I know you were talking about it in terms of not yet art, but I think there's also this not yet language through which we can try and meet or touch with or make contact with these very fragile, delicate, I'm even lost for words to describe what I'm referring to, but I think there's something about perhaps not what possibilities might emerge if we don't be so binary about representation and non-representation, and perhaps look more towards a sort of the relationship. In the same way, I know, Alex, you talk about the relationship between contingency and containment, not as binaries, not as opposites, but as somehow an interdependency between the two. And I think one of the things that's interesting about exhaustion is that I think within there also is the space of kairos. So in exhausting possibilities, sometimes another way appears by surprise, by accident, through fatigue, through simply having reached a limit and there needing to be another way. So I think there is, I wonder, some possibility still for representational modes, with the caveat that they're alert to that form being inadequate, and that they're practiced only in the hope of another possibility that might arise in this space between the no longer and the not yet. And I think that space of this liminal has felt very active in how we've been operating this week. So it's not quite in defense of the representational, but it might be to think about how it might be a point of departure in realizing its limitations. There may be some work in that as well.
I think we come up to an end now, but I just want to also, I think this not yet and still in development, how did you phrase that? It not becoming but not yet. Well, how was it?
Well, it's the Victor Turner's description of
Yeah.
liminality, no longer and not yet.
Not longer, not yet. I think that's very nice, and I just want to point to get dear Moser, he continuously did, while we were talking here, his lines of connecting but not bordering the things. So he's bringing the things into tension to each other with kind of like this idea of potentially also expanding the sense fields, so to say, of those self-touching words and bringing them to another understanding, transform the understanding we have potentially. And you all, thank you for that, Gerd. And thank you all for being here, for really doing that amazing work. And I would love to give the final words to the two hosts of that event. And thank you them for making this, I see it here in Arno's panel, this infinite, the sign of infinity. And funnily, we have from the Zentrum Fokus Forschung, the logo is a sign of infinity connected with a plus. So it's the infinite plus, and potentially this gives them a reference for the final remarks or not, or whatever would they want to say with that.
Thank you, Alexander. Yeah, maybe I didn't think of it before, but this was not a closing panel. This was a disclosing panel in the sense that it was really opening also for me and for hopefully also for you many questions. And maybe I just can say, please let's stay in touch, literally, because it matters. Thank you so much.
And now, as we all care for each other, and we especially care for you, there will be something. Has been something prepared outside in the usual great way by the dear colleague Marianne Mondellos in catering and caring for us. And I do also want to thank her, and very much so also Felipe Duque and Ernst Reitermeier and Victor. Your surname I don't know, but that's how close we are, for your supportive work here, making this week happening, also on behalf of the two guys here, and great to get something to eat and drink. Thank you very much for being here.